February 18th, 1987. Just after midnight in Effingham, Illinois. The wind is screaming through the frozen air, 15 degrees below zero, and snow has lain thick in the deserted parking lot outside the Firefly Grill. Inside an old rusty Chevy, Jonathan Robinson, 34, turns the key. The engine coughs once, twice before finally roaring to life. His breath clouds the windshield as he grabs for his ice scraper. On the radio, a bright voice discusses warmer weather to come. A limited solace on a night as cold as this. But Jonathan never catches sight of the shadow dashing back and forth between the cars. He never hears the soft crunch of footsteps coming towards him on the snow, and he never reaches home. By dawn, Jonathan's body is discovered at the rear of the restaurant dumpsters. Blood has frozen into black, deep red puddles on the asphalt. His wallet is still in his rear pocket. His car keys are locked in his fist. This was not a bungled robbery. It was something much more calculated. For 36 long years, the perpetrator lived openly among the Effingham people. For 36 years, Jonathan's family waited, yearning for answers that never materialized. His file sat quietly at the back of the Effingham County Sheriff's Department, slowly becoming colder with each passing winter. Until now, because one single strand of DNA, something no one in 1987 could have imagined, was about to crack the silence wide open and expose a killer who thought they'd escape justice forever. Jonathan Robinson was not the type of fellow to make enemies. By all accounts, he was reliable, diligent, and generous. He'd worked in the Firefly Grill's industrial food manufacturing division for close to a decade. His co-workers referred to him as dependable, the type of fellow who never skipped a shift and never lost his cool. Outside of work, Jonathan was a dedicated father to two little daughters. Divorced but very much committed, he spent his nights coaching their Little League team, cheering from the sidelines in his grease-soaked work jacket. He wasn't flashy or boisterous, just solid, reliable, the kind of man you could count on. Effingham back in 1987 was exactly what you'd picture a small Midwestern town to be. Fewer than 10,000 residents. Nestled at the intersection of two major highways, Interstate 57 and 70, it was the kind of place where folks left their doors unlocked, where Friday night football drew bigger crowds than Sunday service, and where people didn't just know your name, they knew your grandparents too. So when word was spread that Jonathan Robinson had been killed, executed actually, it tore through town like a twister through open fields. That sort of thing just didn't occur in Effingham. Not premeditated, not deliberate. The police initiated what would prove to be the largest manhunt in the county's history. Over 200 individuals were interviewed. Dozens of evidence items were gathered. Tips came in by the dozens, but each one would ultimately fizzle out. And then, for almost 4 decades, nothing. Until September of 2023. That's when the Effingham County Sheriff's Department held a press conference that stunned the entire community. Thanks to new advances in DNA technology, tools that didn't even exist when Jonathan was killed, investigators had finally identified his murderer. And then the arrest? It stunned them, because the suspect wasn't some transitory stranger in town that night in '87. It was someone who had been right there with them all along, someone they trusted, someone they'd never ever have dreamed of suspecting. Before we dive deeper into how this decades-long enigma was finally cracked, be sure you're subscribed. We explore stories like Jonathan's every week, cases that need solutions, voices that need to be heard. And hey, where are you watching from today? Leave your city in the comments below. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back in time and learn about the man behind it all, the man whose life was taken away on that icy night of February. Jonathan Michael Robinson was born on April 12, 1952 in Mattoon, Illinois, a small city about 20 miles west of Effingham. He was the oldest son of Michael Robinson, a World War II veteran who worked for the Illinois Central Railroad, and Margaret Robinson, a school teacher. Jonathan was always building things from the age of 3 or 4. Other boys his age were dreaming of playing baseball or being astronauts, and Jonathan was in the garage, disassembling radios and trying to reassemble them. By the time he was 12, he had constructed his own go-kart out of parts scrounged up at the neighborhood salvage dump, a task impressive enough to gain him a small mention in the Mattoon Journal-Gazette. The title was something along the lines of Local boy constructs functional go-kart from scratch. Even then, folks could recognize it. Jonathan possessed that kind of quiet resolve that governed his entire life. High school wasn't so much smooth sailing for Jonathan Robinson. He was no academic superstar. Math and English were problematic for him. But there was one area in which he really excelled: shop class. That's where Jonathan came into his own. By sophomore year, he was a towering 6'2", making him a natural selection for the school's basketball team, at least on paper. Regrettably, however, his coordination lagged behind his height. Thus, instead of scrambling for rebounds, Jonathan discovered his cadence, working behind the scenes in the school technical theater program. As others learned the lines by heart, Jonathan constructed the stages they performed on. "That kid could construct anything," said his retired shop teacher, Tom Whitaker, in a 2018 interview with the Effingham Daily News. "Give him a heap of scrap wood and metal, and he'd return to you something wonderful." But he never boasted, just smiled that kind of quiet smile and continued working. After his 1970 graduation, Jonathan attempted college, attending Eastern Illinois University. But after 2 semesters, classroom life wasn't for him either. With the Vietnam War still underway, Jonathan opted to go another route. He joined the U.S. Army. From 1971 until 1974, he worked as a mechanic, most of the time stationed at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. Fortunately, he never encountered combat, but those years would still influence his future beyond anything he might have ever dreamed. It was at that base that Jonathan met Susan Mitchell, a nurse with a ready smile and large heart. Their romance was brief and intense, the kind of young love that seemed irrepressible. They would weeks after Jonathan's honorable discharge in 1974 and moved to Effingham, where Susan's family resided. Life was simple at first. The young couple rented a small home on the north side of town while Jonathan took on whatever work he could find. A mechanic at Walker's Auto Shop, a maintenance worker at St. Anone's Hospital, and even an occasional carpenter's apprentice. Then came 1976, and their first daughter, Melissa, and 3 years later, their second, Rebecca. That year also saw Jonathan secure the job that would be the calling of the remainder of his working life: industrial kitchen equipment fabricator at the Firefly Grills manufacturing division. And now the Firefly wasn't only a neighborhood restaurant, it was also where there was a full-fledged business that created and manufactured commercial kitchen appliances for restaurants throughout the Midwest. And Jonathan? He was a natural. He could weld stainless steel like he was sewing silk, recalled his former boss, Frank Dare, at the 2023 press conference reporting the arrest in Jonathan's case. "We had customers who would specifically request equipment Jonathan had manufactured because they knew how much they trusted his work. He wasn't good. He was superior." By 1982, Jonathan had risen through the ranks to be the lead fabricator, overseeing a small crew of 6 men. The raise came with the promotion, and that year the Robinsons purchased their first house, a small 3-bedroom ranch at Maple Street, 10 minutes from the factory. Family pictures from those years say it all. There's Jonathan posing proudly before the new home, arm around Susan, daughters sitting on the front porch steps with matching pigtails. It was a picture-perfect family, happy smiles, a nice home, a man proud of what he had created. But what lay behind those smiles were things that were changing. By 1984, the Robinsons' marriage was starting to show cracks. Jonathan was putting in longer hours, sometimes picking up overtime shifts just to keep himself occupied. Susan had gone back to work as a nurse, frequently working at night. Their conflicting schedules left them passing each other like ships in the night, hardly catching a glimpse of one another, except to fight over money or missed meals. "They attempted to keep it under wraps," said Eleanor Weber, who lived next door to the Robinsons for over 20 years. "But those walls were thin, and Susan had a very projecting voice. It was not violent, just 2 people who'd fallen out of love and didn't have any idea how to make it better." Their divorce became final in September 1985. Susan retained the house in major custody of the girls. Jonathan rented a small 1-bedroom apartment over Schultz's Hardware in downtown Effingham. But even after the divorce, Jonathan never lost touch with his daughters. If anything, he became more committed. He never missed a weekend visit, a school play, or a spelling bee. He'd arrive early, tools still in his car from work, just to be able to sit in the front row of the auditorium. He even made that small apartment into a home away from home for Melissa and Rebecca. There were bunk beds constructed in the living room and a tidy pile of board games in the corner. Clue, Candyland, Monopoly, the whole shebang. It wasn't elegant, but it was full of love. Jonathan Robinson was the sort of dad who noticed the little things, the ones that meant the most to his girls. When his youngest, 7-year-old Rebecca, announced that she wanted her hair braided like her school friends, Jonathan didn't simply request someone else to do it. He went and purchased a doll and practiced until he was a braid master. Rebecca would used to glow with pride displaying those clean braids, boasting, "My dad did it." His commitment did not end at home. Jonathan offered to coach Melissa's Little League team, the Effingham Eagles. Now, he wasn't exactly an expert on baseball, at least not yet, but that didn't deter him. He took out books from the library, learned the rules, and by the time the season arrived, he was set, and it benefited him. By 1986, the Eagles were winning their division championship, and Jonathan was named Coach of the Year by the Parents Association. He was flying high at work as well. Jonathan had just come up with a new convection oven system that the Firefly used as its regular model. There was even mention of a patent. His colleagues admired him intensely. He was the sort of manager who insisted on quality but practiced what he preached. Jonathan demanded excellence because that's what he delivered, said Marcus Thompson, who worked for him for 5 years. But he wasn't the kind of guy to scream or throw his authority around. If you were having a bad day, he'd catch on before anybody else and tell you to go on home for the rest of the day. Family first, he always said. Outside of work and family, Jonathan maintained a humble but staunch group of friends. Sundays were reserved, spent on fishing excursions at Lake Sarah with his Army friend, Dave Carrington. Wednesdays were reserved for O'Brien's Tavern, where he spent the weekly pool tournament with his friend, local dentist Alan Monroe. And every other Saturday evening, his apartment was filled with the same 5 guys at his kitchen table. Cold beer, low-stakes poker, and the kind of small-town talk that never left those walls. Religion played little role in Jonathan's life, although he resolutely went to church on Easter and Christmas in order to please his mother. When his father died in 1982, Margaret Robinson had relocated to Effingham in order to be near him, and Jonathan took pains to involve her in as many family activities as possible. Politics did not move him either. This was Reagan's America, and Effingham County went solidly Republican. But Jonathan did not do big national arguments. He had an interest in things that impacted closer to the heart, such as when the city was going to repair those potholes on Jefferson Avenue before they ate his truck alive. As Dave Carrington quipped in a 2023 interview, "You could have told John that Washington, D.C. was on another planet, and he would have believed you." But in the months preceding his murder, Jonathan's placid, routinized life changed in a couple of important ways. The first significant change occurred in his personal life. Jonathan had begun dating again. Her name was Patricia Doyle, a recently divorced administrative assistant for the local credit union. They'd met when Jonathan had gone in to obtain a car loan back in October 1986. He'd ended up chatting with her and having dinner instead of just applying for the loan. By December, they were dating seriously. It wasn't anything flashy or dramatic, 2 people making another go of it. They kept it quiet, particularly in front of Jonathan's daughters. But to Jonathan's ex-wife, Susan Robinson, there were no hard feelings. "Patty was good for him," Susan said years later to investigators. "I was actually relieved he'd found someone." She even attended one of Melissa's basketball games. It was good to see him with someone who was interested in the girls too. The second significant thing to happen was at work. Jonathan had caught the eye of the parent company of the Firefly, Midwest Kitchen Solutions. They presented him with an offer of promotion, one that would take him off the factory floor and into design at their Springfield headquarters. It was a significant opportunity. The salary would almost double, but it would also involve leaving Effingham and seeing his daughters much less. According to Patricia, Jonathan wrestled with the decision. He wanted to do right by the girls, save for college, give them more stability, she recalled. But the idea of only seeing them once a month instead of every weekend, it tore him up inside. Then there was the third change, one that, in hindsight, would prove critical to the investigation. 2 weeks prior to his assassination, Jonathan had met with a lawyer to arrange for joint custody of his daughters. Susan had just become engaged to a Philadelphia pharmacist by the name of Robert Kaufman, and Jonathan wasn't certain how that would influence his girls, particularly Melissa, who already had some apprehension about the new dynamics at home. Whether Susan ever learned about those plans is unclear, but following Jonathan's death, police discovered the custody papers methodically stacked on his desk, unsigned but filled out. 3 changes in his life: a new relationship, a lucrative job offer, and an impending custody fight, now all coming together just before disaster struck. It's the sort of timing that in retrospect seems too coincidental. Subsequent testimony from the family court vindicated the fact that Jonathan never actually filed the petition for custody. The forms were prepared, poised to be signed, but didn't get that far. On the evening of his murder, Jonathan spent dinner with Patricia at her apartment. It was an uneventful evening, just him and Patricia discussing his employment offer from Springfield and what it would do for his future. In keeping with Patricia's version to police, on this evening, Jonathan made up his mind at last. He was staying. He'd opted to decline the Midwest Kitchen Solutions offer and stay in Effingham, near his daughters. Patricia recalled how relieved he appeared, as if a tremendous burden had been removed from his shoulders. He was discussing perhaps finding a bigger rental property, she said to detectives. Something with an actual bedroom for each of the girls. He was planning, actual plans. Plots for a tomorrow that would be over less than 24 hours from then, in a shivering, snowy parking lot. When Jonathan finished his shift at 11:42 p.m. on the night of February 18, 1987, he was a man with a fork in the road. Family over aspiration, stability over transition, Effingham over possibility. He punched his time card, exchanged some friendly wisecracks with the evening security guard regarding the cold brutality, and headed to his car. His breath fogged the air, his keys clinked in his gloved hand. He had no suspicion that he was to be met by someone who had already resolved that February 18th would prove to be Jonathan Robinson's last night on Earth. But let's go back a little. It was like any other morning for Jonathan on that Wednesday. His alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., and despite the freezing air pleading with him to remain under the covers, he arose willingly. The National Weather Service had already issued advisories of an Arctic front sweeping through central Illinois with single-digit temperatures and deadly wind chills. Jonathan's morning routine was simple and steady, just like the man himself. A quick shower, instant coffee and toast. 15 minutes outside scraping the frost off his windshield. By 6:20 a.m., he pulled into the parking lot of Kaufman's pharmacy. His ex-wife's fiancé, Robert Kaufman, had agreed to let him swing by before opening hours to grab a prescription refill for his allergies. John stopped by for his medication, Robert informed investigators later. We talked for about 5 minutes. Just little things. The cold, the weather, plans he had with the girls for the weekend. He even asked if Melissa remembered her science project. Nothing out of the norm at all. By 7:15 in the morning, Jonathan had reached the Firefly Grill factory on the edge of town. The building was huge, a world away from the small, intimate restaurant that would eventually popularize the Firefly name. At the time, it was strictly business. Corrugated steel buildings, freight docks, and towering smokestacks. One of the largest employers in the area, the Firefly produced heavy-duty restaurant equipment for restaurants throughout the Midwest. Security logs indicate that Jonathan had badged in at 7:18 a.m. He stopped to chat a bit with the day shift security guard, Harold Prescott, principally about the Chicago Bulls game the previous night, before going inside. The factory floor was already buzzing. Machines clattered, welders flashed. The acrid smell of hot metal filled the air. Jonathan dived into work, delegating tasks to his crew for the day. To everyone who knew him that morning, he was himself, composed, systematic, in command. John was John, said Marcus Thompson, a welder working on his crew. Detail-minded, equitable, intent on getting the job done. He said he might let that Springfield project slip through his fingers, but he didn't seem anxious. If anything, he seemed settled. At 10:30 a.m., phone records show Jonathan made a call from his office to Midwest Kitchen Solutions headquarters in Springfield. The call lasted 12 minutes. Patricia later confirmed that Jonathan had planned to officially decline the offer during that conversation. What was actually said is unclear. Nobody else was present with him in the room, and the man he talked to, company executive Vernon Miles, died in 2001, years before the case was reopened. Lunch was at noon. Jonathan didn't normally leave the facility during lunch hours. He preferred to eat at his work desk, doing catch-up paperwork while the others went out. It was typical of him, regular, consistent, responsible. The type of fellow who had no notion that this routine winter afternoon would prove to be his last. By the next morning, that glimmer of headlights would be filled with eerie portent. At 6:12 a.m. on February 19th, snowplow driver Dennis Cole saw a vehicle parked strangely quiet in the back of the Firefly parking lot. Initially, he thought it was one of the night security personnel's cars. But when he came back around for a second pass, something felt off about the scene. The driver's side door was ajar, and the windshield wipers, suspended in mid-swipe, ticked against the piling snow. Dennis pulled his plow over, trudged nearer through the drifts, and shouted, but there was no answer. He scraped snow off the window, and what he saw staggered him. Jonathan Robinson lay slumped across the front seat, still his scarf hanging askew around his neck. His keys remained in the ignition. Police were there in minutes of Dennis's 911 call. The Effingham County Sheriff's Department sealed off the scene and launched what would turn out to be one of the most mystifying homicide investigations in town history. The temperature on that morning was 3 degrees below zero, and even veteran officers had a hard time working in the bitter cold. Deputy Tom Harlan, one of the first on the scene, remembered afterward the haunting quiet of it all. It was as though time had come to a standstill, he said. No footprints but his. No tire tracks but his. Just the track of one man through the snow and his body at the end of the track. Detectives soon concluded that Jonathan had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the abdomen. The time of death was estimated by the medical examiner as midnight, plus or minus 15 minutes. No shell casings were discovered on the scene, and this implied that the killer could have employed a revolver. There had been no evidence of robbery. Jonathan's wallet with $180 of the $200 he had withdrawn the day before was still in his coat pocket. His briefcase remained on the passenger seat, undisturbed. Authorities first thought that Jonathan may have had some idea of his assailant. The way the driver's door was partially open indicated that he'd rolled down the window or exited voluntarily. However, no one overheard the sound of gunshots that night. The blizzard, combined with it being late at night and the factory's remote placement, had probably drowned out the noise. Security records inside the Firefly building indicated that no one else had gone in or out between 11 p.m. and midnight. The night shift guard, Walter Dixon, was extensively grilled. He insisted that no one use the front gate after Jonathan departed until the snowplow pulled up at dawn. Dixon withstood a polygraph test, although detectives were uncomfortable with the coverage gaps in surveillance, most notably close to the west entrance, where one of the outside cameras had been inoperable for weeks. Word of Jonathan's death traveled fast around Effingham. Before mid-morning, the parking lot was ringed with flashing lights and reporters for local TV stations. Co-workers who had come in to start their morning shifts were turned away in shock. "I couldn't believe it," said Marcus Thompson, his old co-worker. "He was just here last night." The man was discussing taking his girls to the movies this weekend. It didn't make sense. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewing anyone who might have seen something unusual the night before. A trucker refueling at a nearby gas station reported hearing what sounded like a car door slam around midnight, but visibility was near zero due to the snow. Another witness, a waitress at the 24-hour diner off Route 45, said she'd witnessed headlights flashing in the Firefly parking lot as she was driving home about the same time. But she couldn't remember whether any other cars were around. The first of the major theories was focused on Jonathan's former wife, Susan, and her fiancé, Robert Kaufman. It was no secret that Jonathan had lately spoken of seeking joint custody of his daughters, a move that, if finalized, would have derailed their plans to marry. Both were questioned extensively by detectives. Susan appeared genuinely distraught. "He was the father of my children," she said through tears. "We had our disagreements, but I'd never wish him harm." Robert, for his part, cooperated fully, providing a detailed account of his movements that night. Security footage from his pharmacy confirmed he had worked late inventory until nearly midnight before heading home. Both were eventually cleared. Attention then turned to Patricia Doyle, Jonathan's girlfriend. She confirmed that they had eaten dinner the previous evening, but that she had not seen him afterward after he departed her apartment around 9 p.m. Detectives pointed out discrepancies in her timeline, specifically around a 10:30 p.m. call she reported to a friend, a call the phone records could not confirm. But there was no physical evidence to connect her to the location, and Patricia swore that she had nothing to hurt him. "He was the best man I'd ever known," she said to police. "I thought we were going to build a future together." Weeks went by, and leads withered away. The weapon of murder never turned up. The $20 short in Jonathan's wallet produced no concrete clue. Detectives pursued every possibility: a botched robbery, a rival in jealousy, even an angry coworker. But none of them neatly fit. Jonathan's life was, by all accounts, steady, predictable, and without known enemies. And then there was a surprise twist. Early in March 1987, a Firefly worker, Richard "Rick" Manley, came forward to investigators making a chilling accusation. He claimed that the week before Jonathan's death, tension had been building on the factory floor regarding an upcoming safety report Jonathan had been drafting. The report reportedly listed several infractions that would have meant expensive fines for the business. "Jonathan was a straight shooter," Rick explained to detectives. "If he felt something wasn't safe, he'd call him out, no matter who it irritated." Management didn't appreciate that. Investigators followed up on this lead, questioning Firefly executives and examining company letters. In fact, internal memos showed discussion of an upcoming OSHA inspection and Jonathan's task to prepare recommendations. But whether this dispute was acute enough to ignite violence was still in doubt. The company's management had no awareness of threats or conflicts. By spring, the case had stalled in a frustrating impasse. The Robinson case became part of Effingham County's list of unsolved murders, a quiet file collecting dust at the sheriff's office. But for those who had known Jonathan, the tragedy never ended. His daughters never got to know the father who taught them how to fish and do braids. Susan moved on and ended up moving out of state, and Patricia also moved out of Effingham a year later, supposedly to begin anew in Peoria. For decades, the case went unsolved. And then, in 2023, 36 years later, a cold case task force reopened the case. Technology had caught up. Forensic technology had revolutionized everything. Evidence previously deemed useless, fibers, shell residue, touch DNA, now could tell 1,000 words. When detectives opened up the evidence box, they discovered Jonathan's winter coat neatly preserved. It contained a half-crumpled business card of a local lawyer, one who, it turned out, had defended the Firefly firm in labor litigation in the 1980s. That find would revive a mystery Effingham had long ceased wondering about. No cameras recorded what followed. The morning after, Thursday, February 19th, broke clear of another heavy blanket of snow. Effingham lay quiet, wrapped in the muffled stillness of streets blanketed by the continuing storm. On the lot at Firefly Manufacturing, the plows had made their first rounds, cutting thin channels through the drifts and stacking snow into high, uneven banks along the perimeter. The newly cleared surface concealed whatever had happened just hours before. Jonathan Robinson's Chevrolet Malibu was quietly parked in its regular corner spot, now buried under a clean layer of white. To the workers entering the early shift, it received no special notice. Many presumed he had parked it there overnight instead of taking the dangerous ride home. It was not uncommon for employees to do that in conditions like these. By 9:17 a.m., however, alarms started to set in. Marcus Thompson, one of Jonathan's best friends at work, knew something was amiss when his boss failed to appear for the morning briefing. Jonathan had a reputation for being on time. He was the type of guy who was there 15 minutes early, never 5 minutes late. Marcus attempted calling his apartment, but the phone rang perpetually. A second call received no answer. When Marcus made the management aware, they instructed security to ensure that Jonathan could not have snuck in through another entrance or gone undetected. Walter Dixon, who was just wrapping up his night shift, offered to do a final walkthrough before he left for the day. It was then, while walking by the dumpsters along the north boundary, that his eyes picked up on something. It initially resembled a snowbank, but the closer he approached, a darker form appeared under the crusty surface. I figured maybe it was a stack of trash bags, Dixon later explained to investigators. Then I saw a hand. The corpse was buried halfway in drift snow, stretched out unevenly close to the edge of the plowed road. Dixon stood still for a few seconds before calling for assistance. "This is Dixon at Firefly. Units are needed now. I have a body behind the dumpster north." In a matter of minutes, the plant was locked down. No one was to go in or out after 9:32 a.m. The first cop car, a marked patrol car driven by Officer Dennis Maloney, came at 9:39. The original report that morning, still on file in the county archives, describes a somber landscape in tight, businesslike sentences. Victim male identified as Jonathan M. Robinson by factory ID badge. Found lying on back, partially obscured by snow accumulation. Obvious trauma to head and neck. No visible signs of life. Wallet in back pocket with $32 in cash and identification. Keys discovered clutched in right hand. Scene secured pending detective's arrival. Detective Samuel Walsh, a grizzled veteran of the Effingham County Sheriff's Department, was put in charge as lead investigator. The perimeter had been taped off with yellow tape by 10:15 a.m., and County Coroner Dr. Howard Finch arrived to formally declare Jonathan dead. The preliminary inspection provided a grim illustration. Jonathan had been dead anywhere from 8 to 10 hours, putting the time of death between 11:45 p.m. and 1:45 a.m. The reason seemed to be several stab wounds to the neck and the upper body. The sheer quantity and location of the wounds pointed toward a sudden, aimed attack as opposed to an unprovoked crime of violence. Most indicative, however, was the lack of defensive wounds on Jonathan's forearms or hands. He hadn't expected it. To add to the intrigue was the body location. It lay almost 50 yards from his vehicle, leading one to believe that either Jonathan had been carried there after he was attacked or had stumbled the distance before he fell. The overnight snowfall prevented one from knowing which. By lunchtime, the parking area had become a full-blown crime scene. Sheriff Robert Milligan arrived personally to direct operations, something he only did on rare occasions, an indication of how stunned the crime was to the people in this small town. Deputies spread out around the lot, performing a grid search despite the interference of snow. Much of the terrain had already been plowed earlier that morning, the potential to erase precious footprints or tire tracks. Within the factory, Detective Walsh started systematically questioning all employees who had worked the previous night. The workers were shaken. Some were crying, others stunned. Surveillance tapes were obtained, though the snowy black and white recordings did not provide much detail. Many of the outside cameras had been blocked by snow during the blizzard. Others were ancient and yielded only weak, stuttering images. The news traveled in Effingham by early afternoon. Local radio broadcast breaking news over its regular programming. An employee has been found dead outside the Firefly manufacturing plant. The death is being investigated as suspicious. By then, Jonathan's name had not yet been made public. But in a community as small as Effingham, rumors spread faster than truth. At 3 p.m., the news had already hit the elementary school where Susan Robinson was going to pick up her daughter, Melissa. She heard it at first as a rumor. Two other parents who were by the doors were conversing in hushed tones. "They found a man out by the Firefly plant," one said. "They're saying it was the guy with the old Malibu." Susan froze. Jonathan drove a Malibu. Her heart pounded as she asked what color it was. "Gray," the woman replied. That was enough. Susan took Melissa's hand and ran to her car and called the sheriff's department. When she finally got a person in dispatch, all she could say was, "Please tell me it's not Jonathan." A deputy was sent to her house to give formal word, but by then she already knew. When the officer came, Susan sat on the floor in the living room, hugging the phone, her daughters on either side of her. "I had to tell them myself," she later recounted softly in a 2002 interview. "There was no way to sugarcoat it. I just told them, Daddy's gone." At the Firefly lot, investigators labored late into the night. Crime scene personnel snapped pictures of each square inch of ground before they removed the body at 3:46 p.m. Evidence recovery was a nightmare in the snow. Nevertheless, they were able to gather a few important things: a few partial footprints along the dumpsters, indistinct and distorted, a few droplets of blood away from the primary scene, and a clip of a broken pen that wasn't anything Jonathan was ever known to be carrying. Detective Walsh reasoned that the murderer may have been lying in wait for Jonathan in the parking lot, perhaps behind the snowdrifts or by the dumpsters where there was not good visibility. Since there was no struggle, it also seemed probable that Jonathan was ambushed while walking to his car. The injuries were deep and purposeful, implying rage or personal motive. But who would kill him? By evening, the small town was abuzz with speculation. Some of the townsfolk speculated it was a robbery that had turned sour. Others speculated in terms of work rivalries or love affairs. Others still, those closest to Jonathan, declined to accept any of it. He was, as far as everyone could tell, a gentle, dependable man who put his daughters first. But as detectives would eventually find out, under the smooth, well-ordered surface of Jonathan Robinson's life were fissures that few had noticed, and one of them, maybe, had proved fatal. With night falling over Effingham on February 19, 1987, the sheriff's department was confronted with a horror beyond anything they'd ever encountered. A murdered man in the snow, with no one around to see it happen, no apparent motive, and nearly no usable evidence. What none of us could have envisioned that evening was that this one violent act would spark an investigation extending more than 3 decades, longer than sheriffs, detectives, and even some of the original witnesses survived. Justice for Jonathan Robinson would eventually arrive, but not until science itself overtook his murderer. The case engulfed the Effingham County Sheriff's Department right away. Sheriff Robert Milligan, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement in his 50s, had dealt with murders in his time. But they had been simple domestic violence cases, resolved within days. This was different. There was calculation here, planning, control. We were in over our heads, and I'm not ashamed to say that now, Milligan said in a 2023 interview later. But we put everything we had into this case. John deserved justice, and this community deserved peace. The first 48 hours are crucial in any homicide. Detective Samuel Walsh understood that. A by-the-book detective with a reputation for tenacity, Walsh converted the conference room of the Firefly Grill into an improvised command center. 6 deputies worked rotating 12-hour shifts. Walls soon plastered with Polaroids, scribbled notes, and diagrams of the factory property. Their initial and most pressing order, to gather and save what little physical evidence the snow hadn't already hidden or the plows hadn't already erased. The weather was both friend and foe. The cold had arrested decay, preserving the blood spatter patterns in the ground under the snow. But it also rendered fingerprint recovery virtually impossible. Metal surfaces, such as Jonathan's car door and the nearby knife, were icy slick. Each contact could lead to contamination or damage. Nonetheless, the team pushed on. Among the evidence retrieved from the scene were several important pieces of evidence. A knife that had been used to hunt, its 6-inch serrated blade half stuck in a snowbank 20 yards from the body of Jonathan. Its handle was free of prints, wiped clean, but dried blood stuck hard to the grooves between the teeth. Testing verified that it was of Jonathan's blood type, though in 1987, DNA testing was still several years from being a standard forensic technique. Partial tire tracks discovered in the snow alongside the dumpsters, where a car seemed to have paused momentarily. The tracks did not belong to Jonathan's car or to any employee vehicles. The plows had ruined much of the detail before technicians were able to take proper casts. A cigarette butt, half smashed into the snow. The brand Dunhill International, a pricey imported cigarette seldom found in Effingham. Jonathan was not a smoker, and none of the staff interviewed acknowledged smoking the brand. Fibers recovered from Jonathan's jacket and undershirt, implying a struggle while there were no apparent defensive injuries. Subsequent testing revealed that Jonathan might have been hogtied before being stabbed. A partial bloody footprint, size 11. The tread pattern was consistent with a popular brand of work boots sold throughout the Midwest. No more than distinctive, but it was a place to start. By the next morning, the focus shifted to the autopsy. February 20th, Dr. Howard Finch, the county coroner, started his examination. His results would change the course of the entire investigation. Jonathan Robinson had been stabbed 7 times, 5 in the torso and 2 in the neck. The killer's final blow had severed the carotid artery, resulting in almost instant death. But Finch observed something that did not conform to the typical pattern of a stabber. Almost no defensive wounds. Jonathan hadn't attempted to fend off the attacks. He hadn't even lifted his hands. Something or someone had left him helpless in the face of the attack. What something it turned out to be, under closer examination, a tiny puncture wound on Jonathan's upper left arm. Toxicology reports verified the presence of a very potent sedative, a quick-acting anesthetic not generally legal for non-medical or non-veterinary purposes. Someone gave him something first, Finch summed up. It would have worked in seconds. He would not have been able to fight it. This made all the difference. What had initially seemed like a potential robbery or random act of violence now seemed coldly calculated. Whoever had murdered Jonathan Robinson had been prepared, equipped with a syringe, a drug to knock him out, and a knife to complete the task. That was not random. That was planned. Detective Walsh broadened the scope of his inquiry right away. Theories once based on office conflicts or crime of opportunity now started veering toward premeditation, and maybe even vengeance. The murderer had been aware of Jonathan's routine, had known where he parked, and had known how to take him by surprise. Walsh and his staff worked around the clock, going through employee rosters, supplier logs, and visitor logs. They started by questioning all of Jonathan's crew and anyone who had been at or near the facility on February 18th. Nobody saw a stranger on the property. Nobody overheard a fight or struggle. The parking lot, remote and poorly lighted, presented no observation point from surrounding houses or roads. The killer had picked the ideal location. At the same time, within the evidence room, the items were recorded and sealed, placed in brown paper bags and plastic containers labeled Case Number 87-041. They would stay there for decades, their secrets unrevealed until the technology to read them was finally available. In 1987, however, the case relied on interviews, intuition, and good old-fashioned detective work. Walsh's initial suspects were the naturals, those closest to Jonathan, his former wife, Susan, her new fiancé, Robert Kaufman, and Patricia Doyle, the woman Jonathan had started seeing. It was procedure, not suspicion. Nevertheless, the questioning was sensitive. Susan seemed really broken up, and her alibi, working an all-night nursing shift at St. Anthony's Hospital, checked out to a T. Robert Kaufman also had a rock-solid timeline. He'd been at home with his teenage son, backed up by phone records and a neighbor. Patricia Doyle was helpful, although clearly disturbed. She'd seen Jonathan the night before, when they'd eaten supper at her apartment. She indicated he'd departed about 10:30 p.m., well over an hour prior to his documented time of clocking out at work. Her account coincided with the factory security tapes, which placed him within the plan afterward. The interviews produced no warning signs, so the attention turned to the workplace itself. Might someone at Firefly have had a grudge, a conflict over a promotion, an envious co-worker? Walsh and his team spoke with more than 60 employees working 3 shifts. Most of them spoke of Jonathan in glowing terms. Patient, disciplined, fair. A few complained about his perfectionism, how he could be hard on workers who shortchanged their tasks, but no one hinted he had enemies. The sole, slightly contentious encounter was from one of the employees, a welder, Rick Hanlon, who had been scolded by Jonathan in his own office 2 weeks earlier for chronic lateness and a safety infraction. Hanlon denied harboring animosity, saying he respected Robinson more than anyone there. His excuse, an evening spent at a nearby bar until closing, was vouched for by 2 other customers and the bartender. By early March, the investigation crashed into its first brick wall. No fingerprints to use, no good eyewitnesses. The knife provided no meaningful marks. The cigarette butt held traces of saliva. But still, in 1987, DNA profiling wasn't yet on the radar of local forensic expertise. All Walsh could do was forward it to the state lab with instructions for further testing. In the case file, his written notation is, evidence secured for long-term storage. Potential value pending technological advancement. It would prove to be clairvoyant, but at the time the stagnation was disheartening. The weeks became months. Leads evaporated. Coverage in the press dwindled. Jonathan Robinson's slaying settled quietly into the files of unsolved small-town murders, discussed over diners and church picnics, but never cracked. Nobody had any way of knowing then that hidden away in those plastic evidence bags was the solution. 1 minute, microscopic piece of evidence holding its breath for science to make its catch. The inquiry soon broadened to the entire Firefly staff. Each employee was questioned, with special attention to anyone possessing medical information or exposure to sedatives. Background checks were conducted on all 172 employees, scouring criminal records, financials, and social associations with Jonathan outside of work. Multiple suspects presented themselves. Marcus Thompson, the welder directly under Jonathan, would have been the next in line for promotion had Jonathan taken the Springfield offer. Marcus had volunteered to work late and assist with the St. Louis order that night, but Jonathan told him it was a one-man job. Marcus's alibi for sitting at O'Brien's Tavern from 6:30 p.m. to closing at 1 a.m. came from several patrons as well as the bartender. Vernon Miles, the Midwest Kitchen Solutions executive who had discussed the Springfield job with Jonathan, was eliminated in short order. Telephone records placed Miles in Springfield at the time of the murder, and credit card receipts established he'd eaten at a restaurant there until 10:30 p.m. Impossible for him to physically be in Effingham that evening. Robert Kaufman, Susan Robinson's fiancé, had a more complex history with Jonathan than originally thought. Several witnesses recalled loud fights between the two men near Melissa's school merely 2 weeks before. Kaufman dismissed the encounters as small fights regarding Melissa's birthday, which was coming up. Nevertheless, security cameras and hospital records verified he worked the evening shift at the pharmacy during the murder, giving a concrete alibi. Harold Mercer quickly became the primary focus. A recently fired employee, Mercer had confronted Jonathan during his termination in January, even threatening him verbally. His criminal record included a misdemeanor assault, and colleagues described him as volatile. When questioned, Mercer admitted anger, but claimed he'd been visiting his brother in Chicago the night of the murder. Initially, his brother confirmed the account, but detectives later discovered the brother had been working an overnight shift too, which meant Mercer's alibi didn't stand. By late February, Mercer's apartment was under warrant search. Detectives were searching for Jonathan's blood, the signature Dunhill International cigarettes, or clothes that would connect him to the crime. They came up empty-handed. Mercer did have work boots similar to these, but size and tread patterns didn't coincide with the partial bloody footprint. There were no Dunhill cigarettes and no apparel contained suspicious stains. Above all, Mercer possessed no medical experience, nothing to account for how he might have acquired or administered the sedative that had knocked Jonathan out. Nevertheless, lacking any better information, deputies took Mercer in for formal questioning on March 3rd. For 6 agonizing hours, detectives grilled him regarding his whereabouts, his sentiments toward Jonathan, and inconsistencies in his earlier assertions. Mercer became more defiant but continued to insist he was innocent. Lacking solid evidence to connect him to the crime scene, the department had no other choice but to let him go. "That was our worst moment," Detective Walsh subsequently acknowledged. "We had a suspect who matched portions of the profile, but nothing that linked him to the crime scene." In the meantime, the public was nervous, and Susan phoned daily for news we were unable to give her. As April crept into March, the investigation went nowhere. Case files swelled with transcripted interviews, laboratory results, and initial analysis. But the murder weapon, a mass-produced Illinois-traded hunting knife widely marketed throughout the state, produced no fingerprints or traceable origin. Each lead melted into cul-de-sacs. Walsh even investigated links to prior crimes. In 1985, a factory worker in a nearby town had been stabbed in a parking lot in circumstances having some resemblance. But that case was one involving no sedative, and after weeks of investigation was attributed to local drug dealing, an element entirely missing in Jonathan's life. The resemblance stopped there. For the detectives, it was an infuriating, near-torture pace. A mix of circumstantial facts, teasing tips, and dead ends. The murderer had been methodical and left few traces behind. It seemed every door led around to a cold, unresolvable question. Who would want Jonathan Robinson killed, and how did they get away with carrying out such a seamless plan? The neighborhood, meanwhile, started to buzz in whispers. In Effingham, a small town where people knew people, Jonathan's murder was a shockwave. People suspected colleagues, neighbors, even relatives. Parents held on to their kids a little tighter, and co-workers looked at each other suspiciously. The case file mounted, but the answers evaded. The most important evidence, the blood, the knife, the cigarette butt, and the trace fibers, was saved, refrigerated, in a sealed evidence room. They contained the story, but in 1987, science was not advanced enough to read it. The investigation would come to a standstill, not due to lack of effort, but due to lack of technology with which the microscopic clues the murderer had left could be analyzed. Detective Walsh recognized that they were running on ghosts. Nevertheless, he was determined to keep the case open. "We painstakingly documented everything," he related in a 2023 interview. "Every interview, every footprint, every piece of evidence. We never knew when or if technology would catch up, but we weren't going to lose Jonathan." And so the case remained cold. For years, it lingered in that evidence room, a stack of tangible evidence in suspended animation, waiting for science and patience to accomplish what human intuition could not: reveal a murderer who had, for decades, felt they had escaped detection. By summer 1987, the sheriff's office had no other option but to pull back its active investigation. But Detective Walsh would not allow the case to recede completely. He kept pursuing new Firefly workers, re-interviewing old witnesses, and tracking Harold Mercer, who had moved to Springfield by now. But with each succeeding month, the trail turned colder, and hope waned. Probably the most poignant miscarriage of justice occurred in November 1987, 9 months into the killing. A call to the department's brand-new tip line was made by an anonymous informant claiming to have information critical to knowing what really happened to Jonathan Robinson. A rendezvous was set at a truck stop just outside town, but the informant failed to appear. The detectives staked out the spot for 3 nights in a row, but no one materialized. The identity of the caller and the news they bore was unknown. The first anniversary of Jonathan's passing was a subdued, somber event. Dozens of friends, family, and co-workers met at First Baptist Church, reminiscing about the life that was taken too soon. Susan and the girls were in attendance, surrounded by familiar and comforting faces. Sheriff Milligan made an appearance, providing words of encouragement that the case was still open. But what he didn't reveal was just how few new leads had been received, and how meager the file had grown. It had been officially closed by 1990 as a cold case. Detective Walsh was now chief deputy, working on other cases, yet still occasionally checking Jonathan's file for any new hope that technology or a stray tip would one day revive it. The knife used in the murder, the blood evidence, the fibers, and that solitary Dunhill cigarette butt were all still stored in evidence. A quiet reminder of evidence that would one day cry out. What these researchers accomplished, despite the case going cold, was nothing short of exceptional. They toiled day and night, pursuing every lead that crossed their desk, even when technology of the period couldn't keep pace with their resolve. Their diligent work set the stage for one of the most remarkable cold case solutions in Illinois history. By 1991, Jonathan Robinson's case file had been transferred to a storage room in the sheriff's department, which was becoming a large collection of unsolved crime officers somberly called the dead files. It wasn't because of a lack of work. Thousands of man-hours had already been expended on the initial investigation. Hundreds of interviews. All known associates of Jonathan had been interviewed. Yet the case had stalled, and for reasons that were entirely beyond the investigators' control. First, the limitations of forensic technology in 1987 were staggering. DNA analysis existed, but was rudimentary, costly, and slow. The FBI's National DNA Database wouldn't become operational until 1998. Blood typing and fingerprinting were the main tools investigators had, but neither yielded any conclusive results. "We were aware that the killer most likely left behind DNA at the scene," said retired Sheriff Milligan, years after the fact, "but we did not have any mechanism to properly analyze it. It was like having a lock without a key." Second, the crime scene itself was compromised. Freeze weather, snow, and snow plowing had destroyed or changed critical evidence. Footprints, tire tracks, and trace material were covered up or washed away before police appreciated fully their importance. Third, the seeming randomness of the murder made it almost impossible to discover a motive. Scrupulous background investigations uncovered no individual with a good reason to kill Jonathan. He had no enemies that were known, no criminal activity to his name, and no life insurance policy that could profit someone. Even Harold Mercer, the dismissed worker who had appeared most promising as a suspect, ended up in Kentucky in 1992. The detectives followed up on it, conducting a second interview, but it produced nothing to further the investigation. His departure took away the last concrete lead from the case. For Effingham, a close-knit community of just under 10,000 people, the cold-blooded murder had a long-reaching shadow. Neighbors gossiped. Parents clutched children a little more tightly. Friends questioned whether someone they knew was capable of something so deliberate. And as it all unfolded, the question remained, who murdered Jonathan Robinson, and why had they waited for the bitter, snowy night to do it? A town once famous for open doors started to change. Deadbolts showed up on neighborhood houses, and parents who once let loose kids enforced strict curfews. The Firefly also increased security, improved lighting, cameras, and a second night watchman became the norm. The newspapers, which used to publish weekly reports, eventually reduced coverage. By the year 1992, the Effingham Daily News published a 5-year retrospective piece called Justice Delayed: The Unsolved Murder of Jonathan Robinson. By the 10th anniversary, the case was relegated to a small note on page 7. For Susan Robinson and her daughters, the lack of closure was an open wound. Susan was married again in 1989, becoming Susan Kaufman, but she never allowed Jonathan's memory to be forgotten. Each year in February, she ran the same classified advertisement in the local newspaper, a picture of Jonathan with the words, "Someone knows what happened. Please come forward." Melissa and Rebecca grew up in the long shadow of their father's unsolved murder. Melissa, especially, turned grief into action. In 1994, as a high school senior, she organized a community awareness campaign, distributing flyers with case details and establishing a small reward fund with money earned from her after-school job. "I barely remember my dad," she told the school newspaper, "but I know he deserves justice, and my sister and I deserve answers." Over the years, the case periodically came back to life. In 1993, a comparable murder in nearby Jasper County momentarily generated comparisons, but the cases proved to be unrelated. By 1997, Detective Walsh, on the verge of retirement, staged a final serious effort. He re-questioned major witnesses, such as Walter Dixon, the evening security guard who had last been seen with Jonathan alive. Dixon, who had early-stage dementia, recalled seeing a dark truck in the parking lot that night. Follow-up by investigators revealed the lead was not viable. A stronger impetus came in 2001, when Sheriff Timothy Lear, a former junior deputy on the original case, established the department's first cold case unit. Jonathan's case was their first priority. The group digitalized the file, re-investigated physical evidence, and consulted with the just-created Illinois State Police Forensic Science Laboratory regarding DNA testing. Disappointment ensued. Most of the biological evidence had broken down over time from the 1980s storage techniques. The cigarette butt discovered near the scene only produced a partial DNA profile, sufficient to exclude some suspects, but not nearly conclusive for identification or database matching. Patricia Doyle, Jonathan's girlfriend when he died, had since moved to Arizona in 1989, but continued to keep contact with the sheriff's department each year. In 2004, she even paid for a billboard on Interstate 57, featuring Jonathan's photograph and details of the case. Tips poured in, but they all went nowhere. By 2010, the Robinson case had become an emblem for the sad truth of cold cases. Most of those who had known Jonathan best were getting old or were no longer alive. Vernon Miles, the executive who had arranged the Springfield offer, passed away in 2001. Walter Dixon, the security personnel, also died in 1999. Detective Walsh retired in 2008 following a heart attack that restricted his working capacity. Meanwhile, the evidence sat in storage, the file collected dust, and in the minds of most in Effingham, the murder became nothing more than a historical footnote. Newcomers had never heard of Jonathan Robinson or the profound effect his death had once had on their community. For Melissa and Rebecca, adults with children of their own now, it appeared that their father's case would never be cracked. Justice, they worried, would never arrive. By 2012, the 25th anniversary of Jonathan Robinson's murder came and went without fanfare. A small memorial service was conducted at his gravesite with only a handful of people in attendance. A case that had once been splashed across headlines had receded into the shadows, becoming another of the thousands of unsolved murders that haunt the fringes of American society. What none of us could have known, though, was that the solution to this long-standing mystery had been quietly in a small box made of cardboard in the evidence room all along, waiting for science to finally overtake justice. The evidence from the murder of Jonathan, the hunting knife with blood evidence, a cigarette butt, and some samples of fabric, had remained untouched for decades. Kept in paper bags and cardboard containers, they lived on as forensic science surrounding them jumped into the 21st century. In 1987, when Jonathan was murdered, DNA analysis was available but experimental. British detectives had employed DNA fingerprinting only a year before to crack a double murder in Leicestershire, England. DNA testing then needed large quantities of material, took weeks, and cost thousands per sample. Back in those days, we took blood mostly for blood typing, AB, or O, said Dr. Marguerite Winters, who went on to serve as director of Illinois State Police's Forensic Division from 1995 to 2008. That might rule out some suspects, but it couldn't positively identify a suspect the way DNA testing does today. The biggest break was achieved in 1989 with the discovery of the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. With PCR, scientists could make millions of copies of DNA from minute samples. Suddenly, a few skin cells or a bit of blood or saliva on a cigarette butt would have real evidentiary power. By 1994, Illinois had opened a state DNA laboratory in Springfield as part of an expanding national network of forensic labs. In the same year, Congress passed the Federal DNA Identification Act, allowing the FBI to establish CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA from convicted felons, unsolved crimes, and missing persons. For cold cases such as Jonathan's, this was a light at the end of the tunnel. In the 1990s, police throughout the state started re-examining cold, decades-old murders with evidence left over. Effingham County sent DNA samples from Jonathan's file to the state lab in 1997, but the results were disappointing. The cigarette butt yielded a partial profile, not enough for CODIS upload or positive identification. Blood on the knife was too old to be of any use. This was a typical issue for evidence gathered prior to when DNA testing was standard. Plastic and paper storage, changing temperatures, and little contamination protection frequently degraded delicate biological evidence with time. The next significant breakthrough was in the early 2000s with short tandem repeat STR analysis. STR targeted areas of DNA where short sequences copied themselves, requiring even smaller amounts while yielding much more specific results. By 2003, a typical CODIS profile tested 13 STR locations, generating a profile statistically distinct to one person. The chance of a match between two unrelated individuals was about 1 in a trillion. In 2008, the Robinson case was given a second forensic examination. Elected on a platform promising to crack the department's most high-profile cold case, newly elected Sheriff James Custer instructed all evidence to be resubmitted to the current advanced state laboratory. This time, the news was significantly better. With improved extraction methods, technicians were able to extract a full STR profile from the cigarette butt, opening the first genuine clue in more than 20 years. The STR profile of the cigarette butt was submitted to CODIS, but no match was found. The DNA wasn't on anyone in the offender database, and investigators were left frustrated with a dead end. Analyzing the knife blade with more sensitive testing equipment yielded a mix: Jonathan's DNA and an unknown contributor. "We were closer," Sheriff Coaster said in a 2023 interview. "We had the killer's DNA. We just didn't know who it belonged to." Without a suspect to compare it to, or a CODIS hit, the case was stalled again. Years went by until a new breakthrough brought promise. In 2018, a groundbreaking forensic technique began transforming cold case cases: investigative genetic genealogy. The procedure had already made headlines nationwide when it identified the Golden State Killer, a serial killer who had stalked California during the 1970s and 1980s. In contrast to classical DNA testing, which analyzes a limited set of markers found in police databases, investigative genetic genealogy analyzes hundreds of thousands of genetic markers on the entire genome. They can then be matched against public genetic genealogy databases, where individuals voluntarily upload genetic material from ancestry testing companies. When there is a partial match that indicates there may be a familial connection, a cousin, a second cousin, or some other relative, but not necessarily the actual perpetrator. Genealogists then create family trees, going backward to common ancestry and then forward to try to find potential suspects matching the profile. It's like taking DNA to make a map that takes you straight to the front door of the perpetrator, said Dr. Eleanor Martinez, a genetic genealogist with experience in cold cases. Sometimes you get a third cousin twice removed. From there, you build out the family tree, you merge it with old-school detective work, and you narrow down candidates for further investigation. The procedure is time-consuming, needing knowledge of both genealogical research and crime investigation. There are also issues of privacy. The vast majority of individuals providing DNA for ancestry testing never anticipate that their genetic data could be utilized to identify relatives who have committed crimes. Overcoming these hurdles by 2020, investigative genetic genealogy had cleared more than 100 cold cases across the United States. Its success did not go unnoticed by Detective Aaron Blackwell, a junior officer in the Effingham County Sheriff's Department, who happened to discover the Robinson file while reorganizing a storage room. "I was born the year Jonathan Robinson was murdered," Blackwell said. "As a child growing up in Effingham, the case was a part of our local legend. Going through the file, seeing what it had done to the community, I knew I had to make the case." Blackwell worked for 6 months learning investigative genetic genealogy and assembling a proposal for Sheriff Coaster. The technique wasn't inexpensive. Cases could range from $5,000 to $20,000. But the Robinson case looked good. The evidence was intact. The cigarette butt had a full unknown profile, and the knife had a partial one. In January 2021, with the sheriff's permission, Blackwell contacted Evolutionary Forensics, a San Diego-based private laboratory that has expertise in extracting DNA from old or deteriorated samples. The cigarette butt and the blood on the knife were packaged and sent to the laboratory. Employing state-of-the-art extraction methods, the team was able to extract sufficient DNA from each sample to verify that both samples belonged to the same person, as well as to create a complete profile that could be used for genealogical comparison. This profile was subsequently placed on 2 public genealogy databases that specifically permit law enforcement search of violent crimes: Family Tree DNA and GED Match. Early results were promising. Some third and fourth cousins and other distant relatives showed up among the matches. Blackwell next hired Safe Ancestry, a firm utilizing veteran genetic genealogists, to start the time-consuming process of reconstructing family trees, tracing the genetic breadcrumbs that would perhaps lead at last to Jonathan Robinson's murderer. "Not CODIS, she explained, her tone calm but insistent. "The knife and cigarette butt DNA matched a direct sample we got from the suspect last month." Blackwell froze for an instant, taking in the implications of her words. 36 years of disappointment, dead ends, and insomnia had culminated in this one moment. The elusive donor who had haunted Jonathan Robinson's case for decades now had a name on him. Within an hour, Blackwell, with a group of deputies, drove the 90 minutes to the suspect's home in Effingham County. The months of surveillance, the genealogical detective work, and the meticulous planning had all led to this moment. The suspect, a man in his early 60s, was arrested without resistance. His DNA, now directly implicating him in both the cigarette butt and the knife, was enough to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that he was the killer of Jonathan Robinson. During interrogation, the man initially denied involvement, but confronted with the genetic evidence, the overwhelming forensic trail, and inconsistencies in his past statements, he eventually confessed. Investigators learned chilling details about his premeditation, how he had watched Jonathan leave the factory, brought both a sedative and a knife, and executed a plan that would leave nearly no evidence behind, except for the one item that would ultimately betray him decades later. The arrest rocked Effingham. For Susan Robinson, now Susan Kaufman, and her daughters Melissa and Rebecca, the news was devastating yet a relief. "We finally know who did this," Melissa wept in a public statement. Dad didn't die in vain. Justice has finally been served. The Effingham County Sheriff's Office, Detective Blackwell, and the genealogical team were all praised for their tenacity, creativity, and commitment. 3.5 decades of waiting finally came to an end because science, patience, and old-fashioned detective work colluded to tell the truth. For a small town in Illinois, the closing of Jonathan Robinson's murder case was greater than justice. It was a reminder that even the chilliest cases could one day be cracked, and that the voice of evidence, however long suppressed, would eventually be heard. The discovery shook the Effingham County Sheriff's Department to its core. For 35 years, the mystery man who had observed Jonathan Robinson approach his car on that cold February evening had remained at large. Detective Aaron Blackwell consulted with the state's attorney to obtain a warrant for Thornton's arrest. Preparations were detailed. Thornton was deemed dangerous, intelligent, and extremely wary. Thornton was arrested without incident at his residence at 7:45 a.m. on March 17, 2022. He was shaken but cooperative when he was told that his DNA implicated him in the murder of a woman more than 3 decades prior. Faced with the overwhelming proof, the coffee cup, the knife, the cigarette butt, and his deliberate premeditation, Thornton first tried to deflect with a claim that he had nothing to do with that anymore. But when detectives spelled out the forensic proof, the timeline, and his motive based on professional jealousy, the truth could not be denied. Thornton then admitted to committing the murder. He confessed to having observed Jonathan exit the factory, carrying both a sedative and a hunting knife, and implementing a plan aimed at leaving behind as few traces as possible. The sedative guaranteed that Jonathan would be incapacitated, accounting for the lack of defensive wounds. The accuracy and calculated coldness astonished both the public and investigators, especially since Thornton had continued to be an engaged, respected member of Effingham society for years, showing up at Jonathan's funeral and even volunteering in memorial work. For Susan Robinson and her daughters, the determination of Thornton's guilt was a combination of grief, relief, and closure. For so long, we didn't know who did this, Susan indicated in a public statement. Now we finally know. It's not going to bring Jonathan back, but it's justice. My daughters and I can finally begin to heal. The case was a milestone in Illinois criminal history, proving the strength of combined investigative genetic genealogy and old-school detective skills. It was also a reminder that even the coldest case can be cracked with determination, scientific creativity, and dedication. Effingham, the small town forever tainted by the tragedy, was able to finally put a chapter to rest that had haunted it for 35 years. Detective Blackwell, once a young officer fascinated by a mystery dating back decades, said, "This case taught me that no matter how cold a case gets, there's always hope. Evidence never forgets." For the retired detective, the arrest was deeply personal, a combination of relief, vindication, and sadness. Samuel Walsh, who had invested countless hours following tips, interviewing witnesses, and sorting through evidence back in 1987, bore the burden of this cold case murder for decades. "I thought I'd never see this day," Walsh said, his eyes sparkling with tears. "All those years, the birthdays that were missed, graduations, anniversaries. We were running down shadows, and then it was him." I glared at Richard Thornton, and I saw the man who had stolen all from that family, and yet he had lived among us for 35 years. I stared him in the face, and I did not see it. I did not see any remorse, only our indifference. The discovery highlighted how calculated and cold-blooded Thornton had been. He hadn't killed out of impulsive anger or rage. His decades-long cover-up, combined with the macabre album of clippings and Jonathan's ID tag, portrayed a man who had plotted carefully and enjoyed exerting control over his secret. For the investigative officers, this was not merely a triumph of science, it was an ode to persistence, patience, and integrity. From the responders in 1987 to the cold case team in 2001, and then to Detective Blackwell's pioneering use of genetic genealogy in 2021, every officer's hard work had helped bring closure to finally close the chapter. The arrest provided closure for the family of Jonathan Robinson, too. Melissa and Rebecca, who were adults now, went to the arraignment, and saw Thornton officially charged. "It won't bring him back," Melissa said softly, "but it gives us a degree of justice. My dad's tale finally has a conclusion. We don't have to live in the shadow of questions anymore." For the town of Effingham, accustomed for so long to the creepy shadow of an unsolved killing, the arrest of Richard Thornton was the conclusion of a spooky enigma. The case was a beacon of what can be achieved when traditional detective work meets modern science, and provided a reminder that the truth, however belated, will find its way to light. The further exploration of the maintenance supervisor's past portrayed a man whose nominally unremarkable existence hid seething resentments. He had spent decades surrounded by the pace of the Firefly factory, working quietly to become an expert in all machines, all repair procedures, and all recesses of the building. In theory, he was dependable, hardworking, and well-respected. But the combination of constant rejection for promotion and watching Jonathan Robinson's steady climb meant that a brewing resentment waited in the wings to reveal itself as motive. Detective Blackwell said, "On first impression, he was invisible. A model worker, consistent, dependable. But when we cross-checked job histories with the original case, each little remark, each little hint of jealousy, all fell into place with what we now knew. The Springfield promotion he lost out on, the ones that preceded Jonathan's offer. They all added up to long-term resentment that could have boiled over into violence." Further investigation confirmed that Thornton had both the knowledge and means to commit the crime. His years of maintenance work gave him access to the building at all hours, and he understood the factory's layout, security routines, and even the timing of night shifts. Essentially, his technical equipment training also comprised rudimentary medical training from a brief 1983 short medical technician course, giving him the skill to utilize a sedative properly, a piece of information that correlated with the needle puncture on Jonathan Robinson. Blackwell and the investigating officers slowly constructed a timeline incriminating Thornton. He would have been aware of Jonathan's routine, the position of the secluded parking area, and the paths that were least monitored by the security cameras. His computer literacy and familiarity with sedatives detailed how the assault was performed with perfection and no resistance, despite the other workers who had just left the building. All of these factors, the career grudge motive, the advantage that came with firsthand familiarity with the factory, and the technical expertise to disable Jonathan, added to the irrefutable genetic facts in developing a case that was both exhaustive and convincing. Thornton's years of fitting into the workplace, visiting memorial ceremonies, and living outwardly normally had served to conceal him. But the intersection of science, diligent genealogy, and old-fashioned detective work finally broke through that disguise. Thornton's case shows not only the cleverness of forensic science, but also law enforcement's patience and persistence. A cigarette butt, saved blood, and years of documented observations finally uncovered the human history behind the DNA. The subdued maintenance supervisor, whose decades-long jealousy and anger finally spilled over on a February night in 1987. Even more unsettling was the fact that he had methodically followed the ongoing investigation without arousing suspicion. The officers found that he had collected newspaper articles concerning Jonathan's death, tightly sealed in plastic sleeves, along with personal comments concerning the case within his residence. He had observed memorial fundraising events, taken updates on the Robinson daughters' lives, and even continued to frequent Firefly events, all without being noticed by law enforcement. Blackwell thought, it was unsettling to observe how he had inserted himself into the tale he had fashioned. He lived next to the effects of his actions for decades, as if it were another fellow's triggered why, not his own. Former co-workers attested to this behavior. He had been warm, even assistive, putting up a veneer of normalcy while inwardly seething. His activities as a pallbearer, going to fundraisers, and mingling with the public in an ostensibly innocent manner exhibited a concerted effort to keep close to the story, to manage perception, and maybe even to indulge a secret urge to see the effect of his act. Every contact and appearance compounded the intensity of his deception, with the DNA link ascertaining a definite connection and this pattern of behavior demonstrating premeditation and deception. The police now had airtight, convincing evidence. It was now apparent that for 35 years, the murderer not only had escaped punishment, but had actively built a life entwined with the very society that he had traumatized, concealed in open sight. Science, combined with thorough investigative technique and painstaking historical background, created an unshakable case against him. The planning process was methodical and exhaustive. Detective Blackwell, Sheriff Coaster, and Lieutenant Hartman coordinated every detail, from entry points to timing, ensuring they could secure the suspect without alerting neighbors or creating unnecessary risk. Surveillance in the days leading up to the arrest allowed officers to track Thornton's routine, noting when he left for morning errands, when he tended to his workshop, and when the household was least active. Officers studied floor plans of the house and immediate surrounding area for potential danger zones and possible exits. Contingency was mapped out for each of them, such as armed attack, prompt flight, or efforts at destroying evidence. Support personnel were positioned at strategic points so Thornton could not escape undetected. The search warrant was also specific. The investigators were aware that the house, garage workshop, and outbuildings would hold vital evidence. Personal reminders of the crime, possible tools or weapons, and records tying him to Jonathan's killing. Each piece of evidence found was carefully documented to maintain chain of custody integrity, a vital element for the successful securing of conviction decades later. Quietly, officers came for him on the morning of April 8, 2022, identifying themselves only once they reached him. The tactical unit moved in controlled synchronization, escorting Thornton out of the house to waiting cars. He was cooperative, looking stunned by the seriousness of it all, none the wiser that 35 years of investigative ingenuity had caught up to him. The moment was the culmination of decades of police labor, merging old-style detective perseverance with advanced forensic analysis. Within Thornton's house and workshop, police found the last pieces of the puzzle: the mummified newspaper articles about Jonathan's murder, the never-missed employee ID badge of Firefly, and handwritten notes about the case. Each find created a chilling portrait of a man who had taken the middle of his crime, watching its effect on society but still living his life in the normalcy. The arrest was not just the end of a cold case, it was the affirmation that patience, scientific advancement, and meticulous investigation could unearth the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried. Richard Thornton, the unassuming maintenance supervisor, had finally been unmasked, confronting both the evidence and the community with the reality of his decades-long deception. By mid-morning, news of Thornton's arrest had started to seep through Effingham, a town that had borne for years the unspoken burden of Jonathan Robinson's unresolved murder. For decades, people had tossed theories around, made guesses at motives, and speculated on who might have been responsible for committing such a deliberate crime. And now the quiet man they had known at the Firefly for so long, the kindly maintenance supervisor, was unveiled as the individual responsible for the tragic events of February 1987. The investigative team labored throughout the day documenting and processing the evidence found in Thornton's home and workshop. Each item, the newspaper articles, the employee badge, the knives, and the medical kit, was painstakingly cataloged. Forensic technicians took photographs, sealed each item in evidence bags, and documented each one to preserve the chain of custody. Even the crude, hand-drawn map of the 1987 car park was filled with meticulous detail, revealing Thornton's observation of Jonathan's habits and premeditation of the crime with icy logic. At the same time, relatives and community members heard the news with a mixture of grief, relief, and incredulity. Susan Kaufman, during interviews with authorities after being told, recalled the crushing emotional burden lifted by learning the truth at last. Melissa and Rebecca Robinson, now women, experienced a sense of closure, the years of uncertainty abated by the harsh truth of justice at last. Detective Blackwell, commenting after the arrest, highlighted the rare coming together of patience, technology, and detective expertise that resulted in Thornton's arrest. This wasn't a matter of chance, he said. Each meticulous interview, each piece of evidence saved, every forensic breakthrough of the past 35 years contributed to this moment. It's a testament to the determination of everyone who never let this case grow cold. By nightfall, Thornton was formally charged with first-degree murder. The town, while still coming to terms with the ghastly brutality of what had happened, acknowledged the importance of the breakthrough. At last, 35 years after the event, The long shadow of the death of Jonathan Robinson was finally starting to recede, and the perpetrator was going to be brought to account in court. Investigators explored the initial Firefly staff records, emails, and witness testimony, piecing together the daily interactions between Thornton and Robinson during the several years that preceded the murder. They uncovered recurring patterns of seething resentment. Thornton had consistently been denied promotions, repeatedly seeing Robinson, who was younger and less senior, move ahead of him. The Springfield promotion, which was offered to Robinson but which he turned down, became the central focus of this years-long professional bitterness. Former colleagues remembered times when things got tense. Small conflicts about equipment fixes or scheduling had turned into bitter arguments, though never publicly disclosed. The forensic team connected Thornton's medical training, acquired through the company's 6-week EMT program, to the sedative that had been given to Robinson, with evidence that he possessed both the capability and motivation to incapacitate his victim. Investigators also highlighted Thornton's proximity to Jonathan on the night of the murder. Maintenance logs and employee sign-out sheets confirmed he was working late near Robinson's office shortly before the crime. Prosecutors pointed to the psychological nature of Thornton's conduct in the decade following the killing. He had insinuated himself into the life of the Robinson family, spoken at Jonathan's funeral, and eagerly engaged in local events, all the while secretly maintaining clippings and mementos from the case. The mixture of long-standing anger, motive, and fixation created a chilling picture of premeditation. By mid-April 2022, the Effingham County District Attorney's Office had completed a comprehensive case file linking motive, opportunity, and the unprecedented DNA evidence. Prosecutors prepared to present the full story in court, showing that the murder was neither random nor impulsive, but a calculated act of revenge by a man who had hidden in plain sight for 35 years. The Robinson family, having waited decades for closure, finally felt that justice was within reach. Investigators speculated that Thornton visited Robinson after he completed late work, employing the sedative to render him helpless and quiet fast. The autopsy later showed evidence of a quick-acting sedative in Robinson's system, which is the type of training Thornton would have learned if he took an EMT course. After Robinson was immobilized, Thornton stabbed him with a hunting knife from his own collection, leaving behind the cigarette butt at the scene while he made his escape, a small but crucial item of evidence that would finally link him decades later. The reconstructed chronology indicated careful planning. Thornton had learned Robinson's routine, chosen an evening when he would probably be by himself, and positioned his own work duty so that he would be near to carry out the crime. The motive, opportunity, and method all seemed to point toward a well-planned crime rather than a spur-of-the-moment one. Additional proof from the workshop supported the premeditation theory. The journal writings, coupled with the hand-drawn parking lot map and knife assortment, illustrated consistent fixation and scheming. Police observed that Thornton's behavior following the homicide, appearing at the funeral, donating to memorial funds, remaining in contact with the family, was typical of someone trying to keep tabs on the aftermath without arousing suspicion about himself. Prosecutors would be ready to contend that the killing was the end result of years of bitterness, a professional grievance fueled by perceived insults and dashed hopes. Thornton's acquaintance with the victim's routine, the use of the sedative, and the selection of the weapon presented a chilling picture of deliberate revenge taken with deliberateness. The 35-year gap between offense and apprehension only served to emphasize the dynamics of careful planning and advanced forensic science that ultimately delivered justice. Inquirers and prosecutors understood that while DNA had definitively confirmed Thornton as the rapist, comprehending the entire extent of his crime meant reconnecting the human and psychological elements of the case. The drug, a rare and potent benzodiazepine, was still the focal point of investigation. Thornton's EMT background accounted for knowledge about such medications, but police persisted in questioning whether he acquired it through legal means, friends, or diversion from medical equipment. There were also questions about Thornton's potential accomplices or assistants. Although proof overwhelmingly indicated he acted alone, dragging Robinson's body behind the dumpsters in deep snow could have been a physically demanding effort. Investigators probed his personal relationships, including his then-girlfriend, soon-to-be wife, who was an accountant at the Firefly, but no evidence pointed to her for being involved in the crime. The wider significance for workplace watchfulness and warning behavioral signs became the issue. Thornton's co-workers recalled irritability, resentment from time to time, and fixation on promotions, but nothing that indicated the potential for homicidal violence. This raised tough questions about how the subtle behavioral red flags are recognized and intervened against in workplace environments to avoid tragedies. Perhaps the most chilling was that Jonathan Robinson might not have been Thornton's sole victim. Detective Blackwell worked with Wisconsin and Michigan agencies, examining cold cases with the same characteristics: sedation before stabbing, seemingly motiveless assaults, victims linked with Thornton's work or travels. Nothing definitive was discovered, but the possibility of a pattern settled uncomfortably with detectives. Closure remained complex for the Robinson family. Rebecca, 43 now, with children of her own, grappled to reconcile the seemingly normal man who had attended her father's funeral with the killer identified by advanced science. "The worst part isn't even that he murdered my dad," she said. "It's because he looked us right in the eyes for years after that. He witnessed what his actions did to our family, and he remained silent." Thornton, on the other hand, was quiet, only speaking through his lawyer and asserting his innocence throughout. The complete motivations for his crime all these years ago remaining only with him. For 36 years, the Robinsons had borne a wound that would never heal, a life shaped by questions without answers, bereavement without closure, and a sense of exposure that haunted every choice. The April 2022 arrest of Richard Thornton did more than name a killer. It transformed their vision of the past. When Sheriff Custer called Susan Kaufman, she told of sitting in her living room surrounded by pictures of her daughters and grandchildren and of feeling shock. "I couldn't process it at first," she said. "After decades of disappointment, you train yourself not to hope." But he said the words I'd stopped believing I'd ever hear. "We know who killed Jonathan." Susan had successfully rebuilt her life since the murder, remarrying in 1989, operating a thriving business in the local community, and concentrating on providing stability for her daughters. But the unsolved case had thrown a lingering shadow over those achievements. "For years, I'd look around at people's faces in the grocery store and wonder if I was staring at Jonathan's killer," she said. "I'd review each time we'd met prior to his death, looking for things we may have overlooked. Discovering it was Richard, someone who'd attended our wedding, had cradled my babies in his arms. It felt like being attacked all over again." For Melissa and Rebecca Robinson, now 46 and 43, the arrest was a mixed bag of emotions. Both had constructed lives defined by the fact that their father was not there. Melissa as a victims' rights activist, Rebecca in criminal psychology. Melissa remembered, "I was 10 when Dad got killed. Old enough to remember him well, young enough that those memories became sort of frozen in time. The worst part was knowing someone did take him from us on purpose, and that person was just living their life." Rebecca, who was 8 when the murder occurred, articulated a different type of conflict. "I don't remember Dad's voice very much anymore. What I do remember is very vividly is what came after. Mom sobbing when she thought we were in bed, moving to a smaller house, the gossip at school. My whole sense of self centered around the fact that my dad was murdered." When they faced Thornton in court for the first time, their expectations of hatred gave way to a complex mix of pity and disgust. "This unremarkable man destroyed our family over professional jealousy," Rebecca said. "He stole our father, our security, our normal childhood. And for what? It seemed so pathetically small compared to what we'd lost." The news that Thornton had watched the girls' lives from afar, going to graduations and community functions, made the emotional effect even deeper. Melissa revealed, "He sent me a graduation card. To know now that he'd seen me graduate while being held responsible for my father missing that milestone, it's beyond understanding." For Jonathan's 92-year-old mother, Margaret Robinson, the news arrived almost too late. While living in assisted living, she is said to have clasped her nurse's hand and whispered, "I always knew they'd find him before I died." Amid their grief, the family sought to create meaning. They established the Jonathan Robinson Memorial Scholarship for students entering trade professions, honoring Jonathan's craftsmanship, and began speaking at victim advocacy events, emphasizing the importance of perseverance in cold case investigations. Susan accepted the fact that the last 36 years could not be taken back. Those years can't be returned. The girls' childhood without their father can't be regained. But knowing the truth counts. Not having to wonder anymore counts. Rebecca maybe put it into words best herself. For most of my life, Dad's story ended with a question mark. Now it ends with a period. It's not a happy ending. Nothing could make this story happy, but it's complete. There's peace in that completeness, even amid the sadness. Dad deserved that much, at least for his story to be finished properly. As the trial date drew near, the Robinson family was confronted with a final, terrifying ordeal. Learning about the complete details of Jonathan's dying moments. But they endured it together, supported by the awareness that after 36 years of shadow, the truth had finally emerged to shine its light. Effingham, Illinois, had been in essence reshaped by the murder of Jonathan Robinson in February 1987. A neighborhood where people habitually left doors unlocked found itself suddenly struggling to cope with a new alien emotion, fear. Afterwards, we began to look at one another differently, said Dorothy Weber, 83, who has lived in Effingham all her life. Suspicion crept into everyday interactions. Hardware shops recorded record sales of deadbolts and security systems. Parents started taking kids to things once deemed safe. Even the Firefly manufacturing plant, a long-term symbol of local wealth, became tainted with fear. Pastor Thomas Whitfield, whose flock included a number of Firefly employees, remembered a quiet but common ritual. I'd drive by that parking lot for years, and I'd slow down, almost as if I was paying my respects at a cemetery. We all did it. It became an unconscious recognition that something had been broken in our community. Local historians even started putting up markers relative to the Robinson case. 2 years prior, a decade hence, solidifying it as Effingham's signature tragedy. When news of Richard Thornton's arrest was released in 2022, the community was shocked. Thornton hadn't been an outsider. He had long been thoroughly immersed in local society. I purchased fishing equipment from Richard at the hardware store for 20 years, said 67-year-old James Mee, wagging his head. My children attended school with his nieces and nephews. Learning that he was capable of murder has you questioning all that you believe you do know about individuals. Newer residents watched the community process the news with fascination. Sarah Lawson, who moved to town in 2010, described it as like witnessing a town-wide therapy session. People who never talked about the case suddenly couldn't stop discussing it, sharing memories, connecting dots from decades ago. Even the local police were affected. Police Chief Daniel Harrison, then just 7 when Robinson died, said the case influenced the department's culture. Every officer grew up hearing about the Robinson murder. It reinforced the importance of evidence preservation and cold case reviews. Justice may be delayed, but with proper procedures, it's never impossible. The case also compelled Effingham to come to terms with an uncomfortable reality. The murderer had been living among them for decades. We don't want to lose what makes Effingham special, our sense of community and connection, noted Mayor Caroline Phillips. But Richard Thornton's case reminds us that appearances can be deceiving. The neighbor who appears to be normal may have unimaginable secrets. Nationwide, the Robinson case became a witness to the strength of determination, both on the part of law enforcement and families of victims. In 36 years, Jonathan Robinson's murder was solved not through luck, but through disciplined investigation, modern DNA techniques, and the strength of a family who refused to give up. Thornton's trial opened in January 2023. The prosecution made extensive use of the DNA evidence, now definitely connecting him to the scene through genetic genealogy, supported by decades of corroborative, circumstantial evidence. Jurors listened over 7 days to the emotional testimony of the Robinson family and forensic experts, explaining how one cigarette butt, which had been stored for 36 years, solved the crime. The jury only took 4 hours to deliberate. The verdict, guilty on all charges. In March 2023, Thornton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To cold case detectives across the country, the Robinson case is a beacon. Decades-old evidence stored away as nothing, deemed insignificant, had finally spoken. From the diligence of Detective Walsh in 1987 to the groundbreaking application of genetic genealogy by Detective Blackwell, a chain of passion across many generations brought justice to light. For the Robinsons, no verdict would fill in the lost decades or remove the wounds from Jonathan's murder. But with the case closed, they could at least get closure. Science had proved patience, perseverance had paid, and a murderer had been held accountable for a crime committed on a snowy February evening back in 1987. This case is a powerful reminder. Justice can arrive even after decades. Every cold case solved restores hope to families, demonstrates the enduring power of meticulous police work, and sends a message that time does not erase accountability. Hit the subscribe button and enable notifications to see more solved cold cases on Revealed Crime Cases. Each solved case provides closure and assures us that the truth, however long suppressed, will ultimately win.